Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am here today to talk about the American Revolution and specifically about the laborious process of declaring independence. It was not an easy process for the colonists to do so, and so that's what we're talking about today. So, as you probably recall, there were a ton of acts that the colonists were really angry about. And specifically, there was one specific act that angered them the most, and that was the Intolerable Acts, also known as the Coercive Acts. This act was put into place right after the Boston Tea Party. After the Boston Tea Party, England obviously was irate, and they were like, yeah, that's not going to be happening around here. You cannot throw tea into the Boston Harbor and get away with it. And so they passed the Intolerable Acts. And so there were four parts to the Intolerable Acts. The first part was the Boston Port Act, and that act closed the port of Boston. It disabled ships from getting in and out, and so it really disrupted the colonists' ability to trade and to travel and things like that. And the British were like, yeah, we'll open it back up once the tea that you destroyed is paid for. Second part of it was the Justice Act, and a lot of people felt that this was very unfair. Court cases were moved for loyalists. Court cases were moved for people that were non-loyalists and to places that were either more or less biased against them or for them. And so people felt that was really intolerable. Another one was the Government Act, and this disabled people from choosing their own governors. The governor of these colonies needed to be then selected or appointed by the king. And so this governor would then be a loyalist. And the colonists felt that they should have the right to choose their own leaders. And so that was another thing that was incredibly maddening to them and a part of the Coercive Acts. And the last part of the Coercive Act was the Quartering Act, which forced colonists to take in British soldiers, house them, and feed them if they were either on duty or fighting or whatever. So the Coercive Acts it was kind of the last straw for the colonists. So what they did is they met for the first time at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774. And they had several things on the agenda, but one of them was not declaring independence. They weren't ready for that. But they wanted to talk about the Coercive Acts and what to do about them because they were so angry at what Britain was forcing them to do or forcing upon them. And so they talked about the Coercive Acts and what to do. They found them unconstitutional. And one of the solutions was to start boycotting English goods, to really, really sock it to the British with regards to money and their economy. And that was, fairly effective. But they also felt that they didn't trust England. They felt England was kind of tricking them into paying higher prices and things like that. So there was just a lot of distrust and anger that was boiling through this room in Carpenter's Hole in Philadelphia during this time. They talked about it. They talked about what to do, and they agreed to meet again if they needed to. And again, you'll see that they do need to meet again. And at this point, all of the colonies were represented, except for Georgia. Just a little bit of info for you. Not too much later, the British began to be very aggressive with the colonists. And so the Sons of Liberty were a group of men predominantly who took it upon themselves to do all sorts of things. They did little things and nonviolent things like writing letters and protesting, but they also did fairly violent things like tarring and feathering, and then they were in charge kind of the Boston Tea Party. And so they were a group of men that really were anti-British. And so Paul Revere was one of the Sons of Liberty, and he knew that there were British troops that were landing near Boston, and they were after the colonists' weapons. And there was an arsenal out in Concord, about 20 miles outside of Boston. And so the British, when they were coming into Boston, the Sons of Liberty knew that they were going to be heading toward Concord in order to disarm, the colonists. And so Paul Revere, Samuel Prescott, and William Dawes ended up having this plan, and they said that they would notify people in the countryside based on if the British were going to be arriving by land or by sea. And so, in the Old North Church, which is right in the center of Boston, they would hang lanterns, and they would hang one lantern if the British were arriving by land and two if by sea. And they really then, after they hung the lanterns, they ended up riding through the countryside and proclaiming that the British were coming. And so people across this area of Boston were very aware about what was going on. So it was a communication tactic that worked actually pretty well. So let's take a look at this map. All right, so here's Boston to orient us a little bit. This is Paul Revere's ride in blue. You will see that he is captured right in between Lexington and Concord. The British also leave from Boston, and they stop in Lexington. There's a battle here, and then they end up going into Concord. And so you just have to understand that it's about 19, 20 miles from Boston to Concord, and Paul Revere wrote it pretty quickly. All right. So at Lexington and Concord on April 19th of 1775, the revolution officially started. So a shot was fired, and nobody really knows if it was the British or the Americans, soon to be Americans, that fired the first shot. But very few casualties took place during this battle. 8 Americans died and 0 British died. But going back on the road to Boston, because the British headed back after this battle at Lexington and Concord. But as the British were heading back along these lines, there were a bunch of colonists. Because they know the terrain so well, they know where the hiding places are, they know exactly where to wait to ambush. The British redcoats were ambushed all along this route. And so you will see here that on the road back to Boston, the British army was then desperately ambushed, and 74 of them died, and 170 of them were wounded. And so that kind of goes to show what kind of fighting the colonists were ready to do. They then realized, wow, things aren't going so super well, right, with the British. And so they decided to meet again at the Second Continental Congress on May 10th of 1775. And this time all 13 were there. Thanks, Georgia, for showing up. Anyways, but they met in Philadelphia again. And they knew that that shots had already been fired, right? And so they knew that the revolution was probably going to, it was almost inevitable, but not quite. Okay. They, at this point, created an army. They were like, hey, George Washington, you're our man. We need you to be the commander for this army. You're 6'2". You know how to command a room. And so he became the commander of the Continental Army. At this point, they still did not declare independence, but instead they thought, maybe we should offer an olive branch. Maybe we should try to work things out, because remember, there were still loyalists. There were still people that felt they were bonded with England, and they wanted to fix things and make things right. And there were others that were, like the Sons of Liberty, and others that really didn't feel that same way. So there was tension in the country, of course. But this olive branch was a letter written to King George, and it basically was like, hey, can we start over? Can we negotiate? Can we? And King George refused to even read this letter. He was like, you guys are in a constant state of rebellion. You guys are a bunch of jerks. And so basically he was like, no, we're not going to be doing this. And so at that point, we kind of understood that the revolution was inevitable. It really was, and this is an image of the olive branch petition. But the colonists then at this point knew there was really no going back. The Boston Tea Party was like the last straw, and the Coercive Acts, and the issues with the Coercive Acts and stuff. It was just not something that Britain was ready to kind of negotiate anymore. And so, even though they hadn't declared independence yet, the ties with Britain had been pretty much damaged enough to be broken. The first official battle but a lot of people say this is the second battle of the Revolutionary War, is the Battle of Bunker Hill, and it took place June 17th of 1775. So after Lexington and Concord, the British sought cover in Boston. So they kind of took over the city of Boston, but the colonists and the Continental Army had surrounded Boston. Okay, and so the militiamen of the Continental Army surrounded the city, and the British wanted a stronger foothold in Boston. They didn't want to be surrounded, and so they wanted to move north, and so they sent troops to Charleston. And here's a map of that. So here's Boston, and up here is Charleston, and then these are Breed and Bunker Hills. So the Continental Army then occupied Breed and Bunker Hills, right? So they were surrounding Boston, and then they came here, and Bunker and Breed Hill were here, and so they really took up a force there. After this battle, the two assaults, the Continental Army ran out of ammunition, and so in the middle of the night they took off. So technically, the British won this battle. However, because there were such high casualties on the side of the British, on paper, it looked like the Continental Army had won. And the significance of this battle is that to this point, the colonists had doubted themselves. They had doubted whether they could take on the strongest, most powerful army and navy in the world. And the Battle of Bunker Hill showed them that they had that there was some hope for them. And it gave them a little boost, the boost of confidence that they needed. There was a lot of propaganda during the Revolutionary War era. You can see that this is a teapot that says Stamp Act repealed. Okay, they hated the Stamp Act. And remember that the Stamp Act was basically anything with paper, pamphlets, wedding certificate, whatever, marriage certificates, death certificates needed to be stamped, and that stamp was proof that they had paid a tax on that piece of paper. So they hated that. This image was a piece of propaganda created by a Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere, and it is the Continental Army, or sorry, the Redcoats firing upon a group of colonists, and so definitely showcasing it in a terrible way. Up here is an image of a woman who's been severed. Her limbs represent the colonies, and really that is propaganda showing how the colonies need to stick together in order to fight against Britain. So the propaganda was really important during this time. The committees of correspondence were also a type of communication and also propaganda. They kind of dispersed propaganda, but they were, a lot of women would join the committees of correspondence. But it was a way of maintaining communication with one another. They were organized in the 1760s, and these people would write letters, they would write pamphlets, and then they would disperse them to people that maybe lived outside of the city and didn't get so much information. And it was really important to keep the colonists, number one, informed, and then also to convince them that revolution and a Declaration of Independence was the right thing to do. So the committees of correspondence played a very important role in the communication aspect of this time. There was also recruitment posters. You can kind of take a look that, the Continental Army were a lot of volunteers, and there were a lot of farmers and just workers that would use their own muskets, their own weapons. And so at first it was a pretty ragtag group of people and men that were fighting this. And eventually it became stronger, especially after George Washington was able to get some more money from Congress and things like that, but and trained at Valley Forge and things like that. But at first it was pretty ragtag, like I said before, and they definitely were recruiting people from all over. Please come and fight for us. Another piece of propaganda was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine deeply believed that it was the right thing to do to declare independence from Britain. And so he wrote a pamphlet, and this pamphlet was distributed far and wide. And it really was effective. And people read it, and they agreed. And a lot of people did agree with him. But it was a series of arguments about why independence was so critical and made so much common sense. And it also put a lot of pressure on the Continental Congress in order to stop just talking about it, actually declare, right? Declare independence and let's move the show along. And so in the summer of 1776, the Second Continental Congress actually did then create a committee to write the Declaration of Independence. And they appointed three of our most well-known forefathers, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, to create this document. Thomas Jefferson was the actual author of it, and John Adams and Ben Franklin kind of helped and edited and gave advice and stuff, but it was predominantly written by Thomas Jefferson. It was published July 4th of 1776. And this Declaration of Independence provided a philosophy of representative government, a democracy, and a very powerful one. So at this point in time, we were on our way toward winning our independence from Britain. Okay, thank you for listening.